A billionaire returns to his hometown's orphanage and becomes shocked. He encounters a boy with his missing son's baseball glove. Jonathan Clark's sleek black Mercedes glided silently up the gravel path, the tires crunching softly beneath the weight of the old-world luxury. As the car neared the Crestwood orphanage, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the expansive, though slightly overgrown, gardens that surrounded the aging Victorian mansion. This was a place out of time, nestled in the rural outskirts, where the clamour of city life faded into a distant memory. The orphanage, with its ivy-clad walls and weathered stone, had a storybook quality, albeit tinged with the patina of neglect. Every year, as he had done for the past 5 since the disappearance of his son, Jonathan made this journey, a ritual that was both an act of charity and a silent pilgrimage to a place that seemed to hold a breath of the past. As his car stopped in front of the main entrance, he stepped out, his presence immediately drawing the attention of children playing in the yard. Their faces, marked with fleeting expressions of curiosity and hope, turned towards him, their eyes wide with the unspoken question of whether he might bring something new to their day-to-day existence. Mrs. Linda Hartley, the director of the orphanage, emerged from the heavy oak doors of the building. Her smile was warm, a practiced grace that masked the burdens of her role. "Mr. Clark, welcome back," she greeted, extending a hand which Jonathan took in a firm, reassuring grip. "Thank you, Mrs. Hartley. It's good to be here," Jonathan replied, his voice carrying a weight that was echoed in the slight furrow of his brow, a marker of the unseen thoughts that constantly accompanied him. Together, they walked towards the entrance, the door closing behind them with a resonant thud that seemed to seal off the outside world. As they entered the foyer, the laughter and calls of the children faded into a hushed echo, leaving Jonathan enveloped in the musty scent of old wood and wax polish that filled the air of the orphanage. Mrs. Hartley led Jonathan through the winding hallways of the orphanage, her heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floors. The walls were lined with photographs of children who had passed through their doors, some smiling, others with gazes that seemed to look right through you. "We've made some improvements since your last visit," Mrs. Hartley began, her voice a soft undertone to the creaks and groans of the old building. "Thanks to your donations, we've been able to repair the roof in the West Wing and repaint the dining hall. It's made quite a difference." Jonathan nodded, his eyes scanning the surroundings, taking in every detail. The changes were subtle but told a story of gradual rejuvenation, a testament to the ongoing life within the walls that had seen decades of both joy and sadness. As they passed through the newly painted dining hall, a group of children gathered around a long table, their chatter filling the room with a vibrant energy. Jonathan's gaze lingered on their innocent faces, each one unique, yet bound by a common thread of experience. "Would you like to see the playroom?" Mrs. Hartley asked, noticing his interest in the children. "We've received some new educational toys and books. It's become quite the favorite spot." "Yes, I'd like that," Jonathan replied, a hint of a smile touching his lips. The playroom was always a highlight of his visits, a place where the harsher realities of the world seemed momentarily suspended. The playroom was bright and colorful, the walls adorned with cheerful paintings of trees, animals, and fantastical landscapes. Children were scattered around, some building with blocks, others engrossed in books. But it was the sight of a young boy sitting alone in the corner that caught Jonathan's attention. The boy was deeply focused on a drawing, his brow furrowed in concentration. Jonathan approached slowly, not wanting to disturb him, and knelt beside the table. "That's quite the drawing," he commented, observing the intricate lines and colors that brought an imaginary world to life on paper. The boy looked up, his eyes meeting Jonathan's, a flicker of recognition passing between them before he shyly returned his focus to his drawing. Mrs. Hartley watched them, a gentle smile playing on her lips. "Tommy is one of our quieter children," she explained. "He's been with us for a couple of years now. He's very talented, especially with art." Jonathan nodded, his interest piqued. "It's good to see them finding their passions. Even here," he said, his voice soft, filled with a mixture of admiration and latent sorrow. They continued the tour, visiting the library and the small chapel, where Jonathan paused to light a candle, a silent prayer, a wish for answers he feared would never come. As they returned to the foyer, Jonathan's thoughts were a whirl of memories and faces, the echo of children's laughter, a bittersweet symphony that played on the edges of his consciousness. The afternoon sun cast long, golden rays through the windows of the orphanage as Jonathan and Mrs. Hartley made their way to the outdoor play area, a spacious yard shaded by towering oak trees. The children's voices rose in a cacophony of excitement and play, a stark contrast to the quiet introspection of the indoor spaces they had just left. Jonathan's eyes were drawn to a small group of children engaged in a game of catch. His gaze settled on a young boy with sandy hair who wore a faded red baseball cap backwards. What caught Jonathan's attention, however, was not the boy's spirited throw or the laughter that followed, but the glove on his hand. It was unmistakably the custom-made glove he had given his son, Michael, on his 10th birthday, not long before he disappeared. The sight of it clenched his heart like a vice. His breath hitched slightly as memories, sharp and unbidden, surged forward. The day he had last seen Michael, that same glove in hand, promising to return home after his baseball game. "Mrs. Hartley," Jonathan said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "That glove the boy is using, where did it come from?" Mrs. Hartley followed his gaze, her expression turning to one of concern as she noted the seriousness in his tone. "I'm not sure, Mr. Clark. We receive donations all the time. It could have been part of a batch from one of our benefactors." Jonathan nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the boy, who was now trotting over to retrieve a stray ball. "May I?" he asked, gesturing towards the playground. "Of course," she replied, a slight hesitation in her voice. Jonathan approached the boy with a gentle smile, though his heart pounded against his ribs. "Hey there, I'm Jonathan. You've got a great arm," he complimented, his tone friendly. The boy, looking up with a grin, replied, "Thanks, I'm Tommy. Do you like baseball too?" "I do, very much," Jonathan said, kneeling to be at eye level with him. "That's a nice glove you've got. Do you remember where you got it?" Tommy's eyes brightened with the question. "Yeah, Mrs. Hartley gave it to me last Christmas. She said it was from a special donor." Jonathan's mind raced. The glove wasn't just any donation, it was a custom model, not commonly available. He thanked Tommy and watched as the boy ran back to his game, the glove flashing in the sunlight, a beacon of myriad unanswered questions. That evening, dinner was served in the large dining hall where the children gathered at long tables, their chatter echoing off the high ceilings. Jonathan sat at a smaller table with Mrs. Hartley and a couple of the senior staff members. The meal was hearty, a comforting end to a day filled with emotional upheavals. As the children ate and talked amongst themselves, Jonathan brought up the topic that had been gnawing at his mind. "Mrs. Hartley, about the glove," he began, but paused, searching for the right words. "It's very similar to one my son owned. It's quite distinctive." Mrs. Hartley, who had been passing a dish of roasted vegetables, paused, her expression unreadable for a moment before she replied, "I understand your concern, Mr. Clark, but as I mentioned, we get many such items through donations. It's possible it's a coincidence." Jonathan nodded, though the answer did little to ease his concerns. "Would it be possible to check the records of donations, to see if there's any note of where it came from?" he asked, his tone hopeful, yet tinged with a desperation he couldn't quite hide. "Of course," Mrs. Hartley responded after a slight hesitation. "I'll have the staff pull up the records first thing tomorrow." The rest of the meal passed in a blur for Jonathan. He engaged in the necessary pleasantries, his responses automatic, while his thoughts churned with the implications of the glove's presence here at this orphanage, so far from where he had last seen his son. After dinner, as Jonathan walked the dimly lit corridors back to his guest room, the walls seemed to close in on him, the portraits of past orphanage benefactors and children looking down with silent, watchful eyes. The weight of the day settled on his shoulders, a heavy cloak of doubt and fear. He knew he wouldn't find rest tonight, not with the seed of hope and dread so firmly planted in his mind. As he prepared for bed, Jonathan's last thoughts before sleep claimed him were of Michael, of searching, always searching, and the unbearable possibility of coming face to face with a truth that might shatter him completely. The guest room where Jonathan stayed was modest, furnished with an antique wooden bed and a small desk that looked out over the orphanage grounds. Moonlight spilled through the window, casting silvery patterns across the floor and the bed where Jonathan lay awake. Despite the exhaustion tugging at his eyelids, his mind raced, replaying the day's discoveries and the myriad possibilities they presented. He turned over in bed, pulling the blanket tighter around him against the chill that seemed to seep in with the night air. His thoughts wandered back to the days immediately following Michael's disappearance, the frantic searches, the sleepless nights, the relentless drive that had consumed him and eventually led to the end of his marriage. The pain had dulled over the years, but it never truly left. It lay dormant, ready to surge forth with each new lead, each potential clue to his son's whereabouts. The glove was such a clue, possibly the most tangible he had come across in years. The implications were enormous and terrifying. If the glove really had belonged to Michael, how had it ended up here, in a rural orphanage miles from where he had last been seen? And what did that say about his son's fate? Jonathan's heart ached with the familiar blend of hope and fear. He got out of bed and moved to the window, looking out at the quiet grounds bathed in moonlight. The peaceful scene belied the turmoil within him. He needed answers, more now than ever, but part of him dreaded what those answers might reveal. As the clock ticked past midnight, Jonathan made a silent vow. No matter where this new lead took him, he would follow it. He owed that much to Michael to see this through to the end, whatever the outcome. The next morning, Jonathan rose with the dawn. Despite the restless night, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He dressed quickly and made his way to the main building, where he hoped to meet Mrs. Hartley and discuss the donation records she had promised to retrieve. He found her in her office, a room lined with bookshelves and filled with the soft rustle of papers. She looked up from her desk, marked with stacks of files and documents, as Jonathan knocked lightly on the open door. "Mr. Clark, good morning," she greeted, her voice carrying a hint of caution that hadn't been there the day before. "I have the donation records you asked about. Unfortunately, they haven't brought us much clarity." Jonathan stepped inside, his eyes scanning the papers she handed him. The records were meticulously kept, but none mentioned the distinctive baseball glove. It was as if the item had appeared out of nowhere, which only deepened the mystery. "Thank you for looking into this," Jonathan said, his disappointment barely masked by his polite tone. "May I speak with Tommy again? Perhaps he remembers more about how he received the glove." Mrs. Hartley nodded, her eyes reflecting a mix of sympathy and concern. "Of course. I'll arrange for you to meet with him after breakfast. He's usually in the playroom at this time." Grateful, Jonathan left her office and headed towards the playroom, his mind busy forming the questions he would ask. When he arrived, he found Tommy alone, sitting at a small table, working on a puzzle. "Good morning, Tommy," Jonathan greeted, his voice gentle to avoid startling the boy. Tommy looked up, his expression brightening. "Hi, Mr. Clark. Do you want to help with the puzzle?" Jonathan smiled and sat down across from him. "I'd love to, but first, can I ask you a few questions about your baseball glove?" Tommy's enthusiasm dimmed slightly, a frown creasing his brow. "Sure, I guess." "Do you remember who gave you the glove?" Jonathan asked, watching Tommy's reactions closely. Tommy thought for a moment, then nodded. "Mrs. Hartley gave it to me last Christmas. She said it was special, that it used to belong to someone very brave." Jonathan's pulse quickened. Did she say anything else about it, about who it belonged to? Tommy shook his head. "No, just that it was from a special donor, and I should take good care of it." Thanking Tommy, Jonathan stood, a mix of emotions churning within him. The answers were elusive, each step forward seeming to deepen the mystery rather than solve it. But he was undeterred. The next step was clear. He needed to talk to anyone who might have been involved in handling the donations, and he needed to do it soon. As he left the playroom, Jonathan felt both the weight of the challenge ahead and the flicker of hope that, at last, he might be closing in on the truth. After his conversation with Tommy, Jonathan's resolve hardened. He requested a meeting with all the staff members who handled the donations at the orphanage, determined to trace the origin of the baseball glove. Mrs. Hartley arranged for the meeting to take place in the main conference room, where a half-dozen staff members gathered, their expressions ranging from curious to apprehensive. Jonathan began the meeting with a calm demeanor. "Thank you all for joining me," he started, his voice steady. "I understand that you handle the donations that come into the orphanage. I'm particularly interested in any items that were part of last Christmas's donations, especially a baseball glove given to one of the children, Tommy." The staff exchanged glances, their unease palpable. One of the workers, a middle-aged man named Derek, who was responsible for cataloging the donations, finally spoke up. "Mr. Clark, we receive hundreds of items during the holiday season. They come from various sources, local churches, businesses, anonymous donors. It's hard to keep track of every item's origin, especially when they are not specifically tagged." Jonathan nodded, understanding the challenge. "Was there anything unusual about the donations last year? Anything out of the ordinary?" Derek hesitated, then glanced at Mrs. Hartley before replying. "Not that I can recall, sir. We document everything that we can, but sometimes details are scarce, especially with anonymous gifts." Frustrated but not willing to give up, Jonathan pressed on. "Please, if you remember anything at all, no matter how insignificant it might seem, it could be crucial." As the meeting concluded with no further leads, Jonathan felt a deepening sense of frustration. He thanked the staff for their time and made his way out of the room. As he walked down the corridor, he felt a tap on his shoulder. Turning, he found Derek looking around nervously before speaking in a hushed tone. "Mr. Clark, there might be something. I didn't want to say anything in front of everyone, especially Mrs. Hartley. Last year, a few days before Christmas, I received a package marked as private donation. It was unusual because it came directly to my office, not through our usual channels. That glove was in it." Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. "Do you have any record of this? Any documentation at all?" Derek shook his head. "I'm sorry, sir. There was nothing. No note, no return address, nothing. I just added it to the pile of gifts to be wrapped." "Thank you, Derek. This information is very helpful," Jonathan said, placing a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. As Derek walked away, Jonathan knew this mystery was deeper and more complex than he had anticipated. He needed to be cautious, aware that his inquiries might stir concerns or even danger. That evening, as Jonathan returned to his room, he found an envelope slid under his door. Opening it, he found a single, typed note that read, "Stop looking for the glove. Stop asking questions. You're not going to like what you find." The message sent a chill down his spine, but it also steeled his resolve. Someone knew something, and they were scared enough to try to scare him off. He wouldn't stop, not now. Later that night, As the orphanage settled into a quiet lull, Jonathan sat at the small desk in his room, the note lying ominously in front of him. He pondered his next steps, knowing that proceeding with caution was necessary, yet the urgency of finding the truth about his son propelled him forward. He picked up his phone and dialed Sarah, his trusted assistant. "Sarah, I need you here," he said when she answered, his voice a mix of determination and concern. "There are developments, and I might be onto something, but it's also getting more complicated. I received a warning." Sarah's voice, ever calm and efficient, reassured him. "I'll be on the first flight in the morning, Jonathan. Hang tight and don't do anything rash. We'll figure this out together." Grateful for her support, Jonathan hung up and began organizing his findings, compiling all the information into a coherent timeline. He listed all possible connections, however tenuous, and prepared a list of questions that still needed answers. His resolve was tested by the threatening note, but it only deepened his commitment. The mystery of the glove had opened a potential pathway to understanding what might have happened to Michael, and he couldn't turn back now, not when there might be a chance to finally find closure, or perhaps even reunite with his son. The following morning, Jonathan met with Mrs. Hartley again. "I appreciate your cooperation," he began, ensuring his tone was respectful yet firm. "I must continue my investigation, not just for my peace of mind, but because I truly believe this could lead to important revelations about my son's whereabouts." Mrs. Hartley nodded, her face a mask of professionalism, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. "I understand, Mr. Clark. We will assist you in any way we can. However, I must urge caution. The welfare of the children here must remain a priority." "Of course," Jonathan agreed. "I have no intention of disrupting their lives or causing distress, but I must follow this through." Armed with new determination and the imminent arrival of Sarah, Jonathan felt prepared to delve deeper into the enigma surrounding the baseball glove. He knew the road ahead might be fraught with challenges, but he was ready to face whatever lay ahead, driven by a father's love and the hope of answers that had eluded him for years. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft golden glow across the orphanage grounds, when Jonathan received a phone call that made his heart race. It was Derek, the staff member who had discreetly shared the information about the unusual private donation. His voice was hushed and urgent. "Mr. Clark, I think you need to come to my office as soon as you can," Derek whispered. "I found something else that you should see. It's about the glove, and I think it's important." Jonathan felt a surge of adrenaline. "I'll be right there," he responded, his mind already racing with possibilities. As he hurried across the quiet grounds, Jonathan's thoughts were a whirlwind of speculation and apprehension. What had Derek found? Was it a clue that could finally lead to the truth about Michael's disappearance? Or was it something more sinister, related to the threatening note he had received? Upon arriving at Derek's office, Jonathan found the door slightly ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside, his eyes immediately drawn to Derek, who was standing by his desk, holding a small, tattered notebook. Derek looked up, his expression tense. "This was hidden in a false bottom of a drawer where we keep donation records," Derek explained, handing the notebook to Jonathan. "I found it last night after our conversation. It looks like a diary or some sort of log." Jonathan took the notebook with trembling hands. It was old, the pages yellowed with age, and he could see dates and notes scribbled in a cramped hand. As he flipped through, a particular entry caught his eye, one that mentioned a donation received directly by someone at the orphanage, described vaguely enough to avoid suspicion, but dated around the time Michael had disappeared. "This could be it," Jonathan murmured, his pulse quickening. "This could lead us to whoever brought the glove here." Derek nodded, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and excitement. "I thought so too, but there's more," he added, lowering his voice even further. "I think we're being watched. After I found this, I noticed someone lurking around my office last night. I couldn't see who it was, but it felt deliberate." Jonathan's mind raced with the implications. The warning, now this mysterious observer, it seemed clear that his investigation was unsettling someone with something to hide. "We need to be careful," he cautioned Derek. "Whoever is behind this might be dangerous." As they spoke, the faint sound of footsteps approached the office, then seemed to pause and retreat. Both men exchanged a look of understanding. The stakes were higher than ever. "I'll take this with me and study it more closely," Jonathan decided, tucking the notebook into his jacket. "Let's keep this between us for now. I don't want to alarm anyone else or tip off whoever might be involved." Derek agreed, and Jonathan left the office quickly, his mind abuzz. As he walked back to his room, he felt the weight of the notebook against his chest, like a talisman. It held answers, perhaps even the key to finding his son, but it also brought new dangers, as the shadows of the orphanage seemed to watch his every step. The morning sun had fully risen by the time Jonathan reached his room, casting bright beams through the windows. He sat down at the desk, the notebook open in front of him, ready to uncover the secrets held within its pages. But even as he prepared to delve into the mystery, he couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, the sense that the truth would not come without a cost. Early the next morning, as the first light of dawn crept across the quiet town, Sarah arrived at the orphanage, her presence a reassuring sight for Jonathan. Sarah, with her sharp analytical mind and years of experience managing sensitive situations, was precisely the ally Jonathan needed. "Jonathan, it's good to see you, though I wish it were under better circumstances," Sarah greeted him, her tone professional yet tinged with concern. She carried a briefcase filled with tools and documents that might be helpful for their investigation. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Sarah," Jonathan replied, leading her into his temporary office set up in a secluded part of the orphanage. "There's a lot to discuss." Once inside, Jonathan briefed Sarah on everything that had transpired: Tommy and the baseball glove, the hidden diary, and the ominous threats. Sarah listened intently, taking notes and occasionally asking pointed questions to clarify certain details. After the briefing, Sarah unpacked her briefcase, revealing a portable printer, a laptop, and several encrypted USB drives. "First things first," she said, setting up her equipment. "We need to secure any evidence we have. I'll start by making digital copies of the diary entries and then encrypt them for safekeeping." As Sarah worked, Jonathan paced the room, his mind racing with the possibilities now unfolding. "We need to figure out who's trying to scare us off and why. This isn't just about finding Michael anymore. It's about uncovering what seems to be a much larger secret." "I agree," Sarah said, her fingers flying over the keyboard, "and we'll need to be discreet. Whoever we're dealing with is already on edge, given the threats you've received." Once the immediate task of securing the evidence was handled, they devised a plan to delve deeper into the orphanage's donation records and staff history, looking for any discrepancies or connections that might have been overlooked. "We should also consider setting up some surveillance around key areas," Sarah suggested. "If someone is watching us, it's time we watch back." Jonathan nodded in agreement, grateful for her proactive approach. "Let's do it. We need all the information we can get." With a plan in place, Sarah and Jonathan felt a renewed sense of purpose. Despite the dangers, they were determined to unearth the truth, knowing that the answers they sought were now closer than ever. Over the next few days, Jonathan and Sarah conducted a thorough review of the orphanage's operations. They interviewed staff members, reviewed financial records, and inspected incoming donations with a fine-tooth comb. Each piece of information added to the complex tapestry they were slowly unraveling. One afternoon, while poring over financial statements, Sarah flagged an anomaly. "Jonathan, look at this," she said, pointing to a series of transactions. "There's a significant amount of money that was donated anonymously last year, far larger than the usual amounts the orphanage receives, and the dates coincide with the arrival of the glove." Jonathan leaned over her shoulder, studying the documents. "You're right, this could be a crucial lead. We need to trace where this money came from." Their investigation led them to the local bank, where, with the proper warrants obtained discreetly through legal channels, they were able to review the transaction details. The money had been wired from an offshore account, which only deepened the mystery due to its lack of transparency. "Let's not rule out anything or anyone at this point," Sarah cautioned as they left the bank. "This level of funding could imply that someone with significant resources wants to either help the orphanage or ensure their control over it." Motivated by Sarah's insights, Jonathan decided to revisit the list of staff and donors associated with the orphanage, searching for any potential links to the transactions or the mysterious threats. During this process, they encountered a name that stood out, a former staff member who had left the orphanage shortly after the donation was made. "This could be something," Jonathan mused. "Maybe it's time we paid this ex-staff member a visit." Armed with new leads and bolstered by their systematic approach, Jonathan and Sarah felt they were finally making progress. But as they prepared to follow up on this new lead, they were unaware of the watchful eyes that monitored their every move, hinting at the challenges and dangers that still lay ahead. The evening after their visit to the bank, Jonathan returned to his room to find the door slightly ajar. A wave of apprehension washed over him as he pushed the door open. The room was in disarray. His papers were scattered across the floor, the drawers were pulled out, and his laptop was gone. Jonathan stood in the doorway, his heart pounding, the violation of his personal space sending a clear, chilling message. Sarah arrived minutes later, her expression grim as she took in the scene. "This is a serious escalation," she said, her voice tight with concern. "Whoever is behind this is not just trying to scare you, they're trying to stop our investigation." Jonathan's jaw set firmly. "We need to increase our security measures, both physically and digitally. I can't let this intimidation stop us." Sarah nodded in agreement, pulling out her phone to contact a private security firm she trusted. "I'll arrange for 24-hour surveillance and have our systems checked for breaches. Meanwhile, let's keep a low profile and continue our work discreetly." The break-in spurred them to double their efforts. Over the next few days, they worked from a secured location within the orphanage, a small room equipped with surveillance monitors and reinforced locks. Jonathan was more determined than ever to uncover the truth, driven by both the quest to find his son and the urgent need to protect himself and the orphanage from further threats. As the investigation deepened, so too did the emotional toll it took on Jonathan. Each night, he found himself wrestling with a turmoil that drained him. The fear for his own safety, the concern for the orphanage's well-being, and the haunting uncertainty about his son's fate weighed heavily on his mind. One evening, as he sat alone in the secured room, Jonathan's gaze fell on a photograph of Michael that he always carried with him. The image of his smiling son, frozen in a happier time, seemed to mock his current predicament. Grief and guilt surged within him, and for a moment he felt overwhelmed by the enormity of the path he had chosen. Sarah found him like this, staring silently at the photograph. Sitting beside him, she offered a quiet presence that spoke of shared resolve and understanding. "It's hard, I know," she said softly. "But remember, we're doing this not just to find the truth about Michael, but to ensure that no one else has to endure this kind of pain." Jonathan nodded, wiping away a stray tear. "You're right, Sarah. It's just that sometimes the weight of it all seems unbearable." "Let's take it one step at a time," Sarah suggested. We're making progress, even if it doesn't always feel like it. And I'm here with you, every step of the way." Heartened by her words, Jonathan managed a small smile. "Thank you, Sarah. I don't know what I'd do without you." Together, they reviewed their next steps. They planned to visit the former staff member whose name had surfaced in relation to the suspicious transactions. Perhaps this person could offer insights into the orphanage's mysterious benefactors, or have information that could lead them closer to the truth about Michael. As they prepared for this next phase of their investigation, Jonathan felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead might be fraught with challenges, but with Sarah by his side, he felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. The next morning, Jonathan and Sarah made the drive to the address they had for the former staff member, Clara Simmons, who had abruptly left the orphanage shortly after the mysterious donation. The address led them to a modest house in a quiet suburb, far removed from the rural isolation of the orphanage. Jonathan knocked on the front door, his heart thumping with anticipation. After a few tense moments, the door opened to reveal a middle-aged woman with cautious eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. "Mrs. Simmons, my name is Jonathan Clark, and this is my assistant, Sarah. We're investigating some irregularities related to the Crestwood Orphanage, where I understand you used to work," Jonathan explained, showing her his identification to ease her wariness. Clara's expression shifted slightly, a mix of recognition and unease crossing her features. "I remember hearing about you. What do you want to know?" "We're particularly interested in a large donation that was made around the time you left. Anything you could tell us would be immensely helpful." Sarah chimed in, her tone diplomatic. Clara sighed, stepping back to allow them inside. "I figured this might come up someday," she admitted as they entered the living room. "Let's just say that donation wasn't exactly standard, and it made me uncomfortable." Once seated, Clara recounted how a large sum of money had been handled in a way that bypassed the usual administrative checks. It was all very secretive. The money came from an anonymous source, and I was instructed to funnel it into certain projects without much explanation. Jonathan listened intently, his suspicions growing. "Did you ever meet the donor? Or was there anyone else involved who might have known more?" "No, I never met the donor, but there was one person who seemed to know much more than anyone else, Mrs. Hartley," Clara revealed. "She handled the donation personally. I got the impression she might have known the donor. The information was a breakthrough, albeit a troubling one. It hinted at deeper layers of secrecy within the orphanage's operations, possibly linked to the higher echelons of its administration." "Thank you, Ms. Simmons. This has been incredibly helpful," Jonathan said, standing to leave. "We'll take it from here and see where this leads." As they drove back, Jonathan and Sarah discussed their next steps. They needed to confront Mrs. Hartley with this new information, but they also needed to be prepared for the possibility that she might not be cooperative. Back at the orphanage, Jonathan decided it was time to confront Mrs. Hartley. He requested a private meeting with her, which she agreed to with a noticeable hesitation. In the privacy of her office, Jonathan laid out what they had learned from Clara. Mrs. Hartley's reaction was guarded, her face betraying little of her inner thoughts. "I understand why this might look concerning, Mr. Clark, but I assure you the donation was used entirely for the benefit of the orphanage," she explained, though her voice lacked its usual firmness. "Who was the donor, Mrs. Hartley? Why the secrecy?" Jonathan pressed, feeling the tension rise between them. After a long pause, Mrs. Hartley took a deep breath. "The donor wished to remain anonymous. I respected their wishes. As to the secrecy, it was their condition for making the donation. I was told it involved sensitive family matters." This partial admission only deepened the mystery. As Jonathan prepared to delve deeper, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. Excusing himself, he stepped outside to take it. It was Derek, sounding breathless. "Mr. Clark, you need to come to my office immediately. I've found something, an old security tape from the night the donation was delivered. You need to see this." Rushing to Derek's office, Jonathan and Sarah watched the grainy footage. It showed a figure delivering a briefcase to Mrs. Hartley late at night, the face obscured by shadows. The figure was not alone. Another person was with them, lurking in the background, someone familiar. "It's Michael," Jonathan whispered, his voice cracking as he recognized his son, even in the dim footage. His presence there, on the night of the mysterious donation, changed everything. The revelation from the security footage left Jonathan reeling. Seeing Michael on the tape, apparently involved in some secretive transaction at the orphanage, raised more questions than it answered. It also cast a shadow of doubt over everything Jonathan thought he knew about his son's disappearance. Back in Mrs. Hartley's office, Jonathan confronted her with the new evidence. "Explain this. Why was my son here? And what was his role in this donation?" he demanded, his voice thick with emotion. Mrs. Hartley, now visibly shaken, took a moment before responding. I was told he needed to be there as part of the conditions of the donation. I never understood why, but I was assured it was for a good cause. Please believe me, Mr. Clark. I thought it was helping the orphanage." "Who told you that? Who are these donors?" Jonathan pressed, his frustration mounting. Mrs. Hartley sighed deeply, the weight of her secrets seeming to bow her shoulders. "I can only tell you that it was arranged by a powerful benefactor, someone with significant influence. I was instructed never to ask too many questions. I'm sorry, I never imagined it would lead to this." Sarah, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "We need names, Mrs. Hartley. This isn't just about the orphanage anymore. It's about illegal activities involving minors. You need to help us get to the bottom of this." Facing the seriousness of the situation, Mrs. Hartley nodded slowly, her defeat evident. "I'll give you all the information I have. I just need a little time to gather the documents." Jonathan agreed, though he made it clear they would be watching closely. As they left her office, Sarah turned to him. "We're going to need legal advice and possibly law enforcement involvement. This is bigger than we thought." Jonathan nodded, his mind racing with the implications of his son's involvement. "Let's get everything we need to expose this operation. No one else should go through this." In the following days, Jonathan and Sarah worked tirelessly, gathering evidence and documenting everything Mrs. Hartley provided. They also enlisted the help of a trusted attorney who specialized in criminal cases involving children. As they delved deeper, it became clear that the orphanage had been used as a front for a larger network that manipulated donation funds for other, possibly illicit purposes. The scope of the operation was alarming, extending beyond the local community and involving influential figures. The situation escalated when Jonathan received another threatening message, this time more direct. "Stop now, or you'll regret it." The threat was coupled with a disturbing incident where someone vandalized his car. Sarah increased security measures, installing surveillance cameras around their temporary office and coordinating with local police for regular patrols. Despite these precautions, the palpable sense of danger grew each day. One afternoon, as Jonathan reviewed files from Mrs. Hartley, he found a series of encrypted emails that linked the orphanage's mysterious benefactor to a known criminal syndicate. The breakthrough was significant, but it also put them at greater risk. "Look at this," Jonathan said to Sarah, pointing at the decoded emails. "It confirms the connection. We need to act fast before they realize we've accessed this." Sarah, looking over the documents, nodded in agreement. "I'll arrange a meeting with the FBI. With this evidence, they can't ignore us." The decision to involve federal authorities marked a turning point. They were no longer just digging for the truth about Michael. They were actively working to dismantle a criminal enterprise. As they prepared for the next phase of their investigation, Jonathan felt a mixture of anticipation and fear. He was closer than ever to finding out what happened to Michael, but the path ahead promised to be fraught with challenges. "We're in this together," Sarah reassured him, sensing his unease. "We'll see it through, no matter what." With a heavy heart, but a steadfast resolve, Jonathan readied himself for the battle ahead. It was no longer just a search for his son. It was a fight for justice. As Jonathan and Sarah's investigation drew closer to exposing the criminal syndicate connected to the orphanage, the air around them thickened with tension. Their every move was now shadowed by an unspoken threat that hung like a dark cloud over their efforts. Late one evening, as they were finalizing the documents to hand over to the FBI, Sarah received a frantic call from Derek. "Sarah, it's Tommy. He's gone. He was playing in the yard, and now we can't find him anywhere." Her voice was tight with panic, the fear evident. Jonathan grabbed the phone, his voice urgent. "Derek, tell me exactly what happened." "We were all inside for dinner, and Tommy asked to go out to the yard to get his ball. It was just for a minute. When we checked, he wasn't there anymore. We've searched everywhere," Derek explained, his voice shaking. Without a moment's hesitation, Jonathan and Sarah rushed to the orphanage. The staff and a few local police officers were already scouring the area. The sun had set, casting long shadows that turned the familiar setting into a landscape fraught with danger. As they coordinated with the police, Jonathan received a blocked text message on his phone. "If you want the boy safe, stop your investigation. This is your last warning." The message hit him like a physical blow. This was no longer just about hidden crimes or long-buried secrets. It was now a direct attack on an innocent child's life. Sarah, seeing the change in Jonathan's demeanor, stepped closer. "What is it? What happened?" He showed her the message, his hands clenched in fury and fear. "They took Tommy. They're using him to stop us." The realization that the syndicate would stoop to kidnapping a child to protect themselves was a chilling testament to their ruthlessness. Sarah immediately contacted the FBI, relaying the urgency of the situation. "We need all available resources now. A child's life is at stake." The night grew intense as they set up a command center in the orphanage, with law enforcement flooding the area. The community rallied, the gravity of the threat pulling everyone together in a desperate search for Tommy. With the FBI involved, the investigation accelerated. Agents swarmed the orphanage and began a meticulous examination of every contact, every financial transaction that could lead them to Tommy. Surveillance footage from around the area was gathered and analyzed, showing a black van circling the orphanage before Tommy disappeared. As they viewed the footage, Jonathan felt a surge of helplessness mixed with anger. "We need to find him, Sarah. He's just a boy. He shouldn't have to pay for our pursuit of justice." "I know, Jonathan. We'll find him," Sarah reassured him, though her eyes reflected her own fears. The FBI managed to trace the van to a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Armed with this information, a SWAT team was deployed, with Jonathan and Sarah waiting anxiously for any news. Meanwhile, Jonathan's resolve hardened. "Once we get through this, once Tommy is safe, I want to go public with everything. The whole story. Maybe it's the only way to prevent them from hurting anyone else." Sarah agreed, her determination matching his. "Let's end this, once and for all." As dawn approached, the SWAT team stormed the warehouse. The operation was tense, with every passing second stretching out like an eternity until the team's leader finally radioed in, "We've got him. The boy is safe." Relief flooded Jonathan, nearly buckling his knees. "Thank you," he breathed, his gratitude immense. With Tommy safe, the syndicate's operations began to unravel. Several arrests were made that morning, including key figures linked to the orphanage's mysterious donations. However, the fight was far from over. The deeper they delved into the syndicate's activities, the more they uncovered, suggesting a network that extended beyond anything they had anticipated. As they prepared for the challenges ahead, Jonathan and Sarah knew that their journey was entering a new phase. The battle for justice was just beginning, and they were ready to face whatever came their way, fortified by their small victory in saving Tommy. In the aftermath of Tommy's rescue, Jonathan and Sarah regrouped to focus on the broader implications of their findings. With Tommy safe and back at the orphanage, they turned their attention to dismantling the remaining elements of the criminal syndicate that had infiltrated not just the orphanage, but extended into deeper, more corrupt parts of society. "Sarah, we need to strategize," Jonathan stated, as they sat down in their makeshift command center, littered with documents and digital screens displaying various data points. "We've only scratched the surface. The syndicate is extensive and well entrenched." Sarah nodded, her laptop open to a complex flowchart of the syndicate's structure. "I agree. Our next step should involve coordinating with federal agencies. We've got to leverage the evidence we've gathered to get more resources." Their plan involved setting up a series of raids and coordinating with the media to expose the syndicate publicly. Jonathan knew the risks were high, but so were the stakes. "We need to be swift and precise. Once we start this, there's no turning back," he said, determination stealing his features. Meanwhile, they tightened security around the orphanage and prepared the staff and children for potential fallout. The community around the orphanage, once unaware of the dark undercurrents, now rallied in support, providing additional safety in numbers. With everything in place, the coordinated raids began under the cover of darkness. Multiple teams descended on locations that had been identified as critical nodes in the syndicate's operations. Jonathan, though not directly involved in the raids, waited anxiously for updates. Each call that came through was a mix of relief and tension. One location secured, critical evidence found, but still more ground to cover. Sarah coordinated the operations from their command center, her voice calm and clear over the radio, directing teams as they reported back. Then a breakthrough occurred. One of the teams discovered a series of encrypted files that, once cracked, revealed the full extent of the syndicate's reach and its connections to legitimate businesses and government officials. It was the smoking gun they needed to bring the full weight of the law to bear on the criminal network. As dawn broke, the media began to pick up the story. News vans and reporters converged on the scenes of the raids, broadcasting live the unraveling of a scandal that shook the community to its core. Jonathan watched the coverage, a complex mix of emotions churning within him. There was triumph, yes, but also a profound sorrow for all that had been lost and the innocence that had been exploited. "Jonathan, we've got a lead on where they might be holding others who were taken by the syndicate," Sarah interrupted his thoughts, her eyes alight with urgency. "We've got one more location to hit." Without hesitation, Jonathan readied himself to join the final raid. This was what they had been working towards. All the leads, all the evidence had led here. It was time to end this, once and for all. The final raid led Jonathan and an FBI SWAT team to an abandoned industrial complex on the outskirts of the city. The early morning mist clung to the dilapidated structures, creating an eerie atmosphere. As they approached, the tension among the team was palpable. This was the culmination of their tireless efforts. Jonathan, though not armed, wore a bulletproof vest, his presence a symbol of the personal stakes involved. As the SWAT team breached the first building, their movements were precise, the result of countless hours of training and preparation. Jonathan stayed back with a few agents, his eyes scanning every open door, every cleared room for any sign of his son, Michael, Minutes felt like hours until a shout from one of the agents pierced the air. "Clear! We've got something here." Jonathan rushed into the dimly lit room, his heart in his throat. There, among several frightened faces, was a young man who looked unmistakably like his son, albeit older and wearier. "Michael!" Jonathan's voice broke on the name. The young man turned, his eyes widening in a mix of fear and recognition. "Dad!" His voice was a hoarse whisper. The reunion was emotionally charged, both father and son holding each other, years of pain and separation melting into tears and relieved laughter. The agents respectfully gave them a moment, continuing to secure the area and attending to the others who had been held captive. As Jonathan and Michael walked out of the building, the rising sun cast long shadows behind them, symbolizing the dark past they were leaving and the hopeful future they were stepping into. With the successful raid and the rescue of Michael and others, the syndicate's operations were effectively dismantled. The evidence gathered led to multiple arrests and trials, exposing the deep corruption that had allowed such a criminal network to flourish. In the weeks that followed, Jonathan and Michael spent much time together, rebuilding their relationship. Jonathan learned of the coercion that had forced Michael into the syndicate's clutches, and together they worked through the trauma with the help of professional counselors. During this time, Jonathan made a significant decision. He chose to step back from his business endeavors to focus on advocacy and support for families of missing children. He established a foundation in Michael's name, dedicated to preventing child exploitation and aiding law enforcement in tracking missing children cases. The sacrifices Jonathan made were not just in his personal quest for his son, but also in his professional life, choosing to use his resources and influence to make a lasting difference. As the trials continued and the full extent of the syndicate's crimes were brought to light, Jonathan stood as a witness, his testimony crucial in securing convictions. His role in the investigation earned him respect and gratitude from the community and law enforcement alike. Sarah, ever the loyal assistant and now a close family friend, continued to work by Jonathan's side, managing the foundation. Together, they forged a new path, driven by a mission to protect and uplift those who had no one else to turn to. The story of Jonathan and Michael became a beacon of hope for many, a testament to the power of resilience and the enduring bond between a father and his son. As the trials concluded, resulting in significant convictions and the dismantling of the criminal network, Jonathan's relief was palpable. He had been through a crucible, but the outcome, justice served and his son safe, was worth every challenge faced along the way. His foundation quickly became a beacon of hope and a resource for families with missing children, providing not just financial support, but also advocacy and guidance. One afternoon, Jonathan and Michael sat in the newly established resource center that formed the heart of the foundation. Surrounded by photos of children who had been brought home by their efforts and others still missing, they discussed plans for a new initiative. "We've made a difference, Dad," Michael said, looking around at the walls lined with thankful letters from families they'd helped. "It's more than I thought possible when I was out there." Jonathan placed a hand on his son's shoulder, feeling the bond between them, stronger for the trials they had endured. "We did this together, son, and we'll keep making a difference. No one should have to go through what you did, what we did." Their conversation was a mixture of planning and reflection. They talked about expanding the reach of the foundation, using Jonathan's business acumen and Michael's first-hand experience to drive change at a national level. The work was far from over, but they were committed to seeing it through together. Several months later, at a national conference on child safety and anti-trafficking, Jonathan was invited to speak. As he stood at the podium, looking out over a crowd of law enforcement officers, social workers, activists, and families, He felt a surge of pride and purpose. Today, I stand before you not just as a businessman or a philanthropist, but as a father who fought against unimaginable darkness to bring his son home, Jonathan began, his voice steady and clear. Through our ordeal, I learned that the depths of despair are matched only by the heights of our collective human spirit and resilience. He spoke of the Foundation's work, the partnerships they'd formed, and the lives they'd touched. He talked about the need for ongoing vigilance and community involvement to prevent and combat the exploitation of children. As he concluded, the applause was thunderous, resonating with the weight of shared commitment among those present. Michael joined him on stage, and together they received the gratitude and support of the crowd. After the conference, back at the Foundation, Jonathan and Michael reviewed updates on several ongoing cases. Each success story reinforced their resolve, and each unresolved case sharpened their focus. The journey from despair to hope, from victim to advocate, had transformed not just their lives, but also the lives of countless others touched by their efforts. The Foundation was not just a legacy of what they had endured, but a beacon for what could be achieved when love, resilience, and justice prevailed. As the sun set outside the window of his office, Jonathan looked at the photographs on his desk, images of Michael at various ages, a constant reminder of why he started this journey. He knew the road ahead would still hold challenges, but he faced them with a fortified spirit, knowing that he was no longer just fighting for Michael, but for all children who still needed to find their way back home. With the Foundation established and growing, Jonathan finally felt a sense of peace. The battle was hard won, but it brought him back to his son and gave them a purpose that transcended their own experiences, a purpose that was now woven into the fabric of their lives. If you enjoyed, please consider subscribing to our channel and supporting us through the thanks button.